around $3,200.
Sounds good. We thank everybody who's paid the dues this year. They go to handle our various expenses that we've got, particularly in the last year or so in the technology area. I want to mention this to the group. I am assuming we are probably looking at doing virtual presentations at least until the first of the year. Are people comfortable with that approach, or are people thinking that prior to that they want to get back together face to face?
Connected to SAMSUNG SMG930A.
Yeah, Bill, this is Rich. I think it's kind of dependent on, some of the, the mandates in Dane County and how comfortable people are, masking up and meeting. I think we have the opportunity to meet in person, but, how comfortable are people masking up and getting together in person? So, personally, I'm okay dealing with that, dealing with that, but I don't know how other people are.
I think the current Dane County mandate goes through mid-November at this point.
I belong to WEAC, and they have blocked all person meetings until at least January.
Okay. We'll continue to then virtual until we decide different. Any upcoming meetings that people would like to share with the group? All righty. Let's move on to our
Bill, this is Rich again. With Steve Sheets resigning from the position of webmaster and Facebook, in the interim period of time, I'm comfortable doing that. But as I said in the newsletter, we're putting a appeal out to someone who might be able to volunteer probably 1 to 2 hours a month to help post our notices to the web page and update the Facebook page. So if you know of anybody that would be willing to kind of offer their services and time and it feels comfortable with that type of technology, I would be willing to help train them and kind of show them the ropes on that. So anyway, pass the word around.
I'll reach out to and see if that works.
Okay.
With that,
Bill, I would like to suggest that one of our hosts mute all at this point in time, and so we don't get any background, any phone calls or any other.
How do we get all of our pictures off the screen?
down in the left-hand corner of your screen, you should have a stop video, which will stop your picture from going out.
Okay.
And then you'll just get your name will appear.
All right, thank you.
But I think the easiest way is to either Rich or Chris to can you have a mute all?
Yeah, actually, if you go under the participants icon on the bottom of the screen, since you're the host now, there should be a mute all.
1 second, guys. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Looks like that's everybody but me for now. Is that my cue to start?
Chris, sorry, yes. I was going to give you an introduction before I got muted, but Chris is the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum and has been an active participant in the group for the last year or so and has kindly agreed to speak to us on Billy Mitchell and the Admirals Wept. So, Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's great to see everybody tonight. I hope everybody's doing well. As Bill mentioned, it's been an interesting year and a half or so since I got to Madison. I got here in January of 2020. I will say, however, that I have very, very deep roots here in and around Madison. I've got a lot of family on the west side of Madison. My ancestors go back to the founding of New Glarus in 1845. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean I get stock in the beer company, I'm sorry to say. But so Wisconsin, coming here to Wisconsin was actually something of a homecoming, even though I'd never actually lived here. I've been coming here enough. I remember Madison back when, as I'm sure many of you do as well, and have watched the changes over the years to this town. But it's great to be here. If you haven't been down to the Veterans Museum, please do come down and see us. We've got some great exhibits. We've got some great refreshed exhibits. And if nothing else, you can come and see our new special exhibit, which is opening November 5th. It's Souvenirs of Service, the things they kept. And we're looking at what soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines brought back from the battlefield to remember their services. And that's opening again November 5th. So please come down and see us. But I know that's not why you're here to listen to me tonight. You want me to talk about Billy Mitchell. And I am going to share my screen. And let's get into the presentation here, shall we? Can you all see this? Should be a full screen, title page, the whole bit. Great, thank you. There was a series of bombing tests in the North Atlantic off of the coast of Virginia, where I used to live, as a matter of fact. I came here from Norfolk, Virginia Beach area in Virginia. As you can see, June and July of 1921. So 100 years ago this summer, and a little bit in the fall, we'll talk about that as well. It was a real landmark for aviation, the Atlantic bombing tests. And tonight, in the time that I have, we're going to talk about those. We're obviously going to talk about the role of Wisconsin's Billy Mitchell in this, because in many ways, this is A, one of the high points of his career, but B, he is probably the name that comes up fastest when you start talking about the Atlantic bombing tests. And then we'll look a little bit at their impact on history, what happened 100 years ago, as I mentioned, this summer. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, I want you to get these 3 points. First of all, the bombing tests, as I've already alluded to, were a major aviation milestone for reasons that we will talk about shortly. They proved that airplanes alone could sink ships solely from the air. That's a big deal. That had not been done before the summer of 1921. They were also a personal triumph for Billy Mitchell. And then they foreshadowed the future, impacted the development of American military aviation. And so those are the key points that you're going to get, that I want you to get coming out of this presentation here this evening. Now, before we actually talk about the bombing test, before we actually start bombing ships, I do want to, or metaphorically that is, I do want to talk about kind of the background and the context for how we end up doing these tests in the summer of 1921. It's right after World War I. You need to understand where we are in the development of aviation, first of all. It's right after World War I. Aviation, of course, is 1903. So by 1918, when World War I ends, where the airplane had really started to demonstrate its potential as a weapon of war, it's only 15 years old in 1918. The airplane is only 18 when Billy Mitchell flies it against these targets in the summer of 1921. So we're still very early in the development of aviation. But there's no question that at the end of World War I, the airplane is a factor in warfare going forward. Of course, the question is, how much of a factor? There's a lot of debates about this. People like Billy Mitchell and his acolytes, and we'll talk more about him in a little bit in more detail, believe that the airplane can be potentially the decisive weapon of war going forward, rendering surface navies, ground fleet forces obsolete. Obviously, there are sailors, there are Army ground forces personnel that hold a very different view. And so these debates are starting to happen after World War I based on the experiences in France and on the Western Front. All of this is happening as the defense pie, budget pie, is shrinking. The 1920 Defense Act had shrunk the defense back, but it also set up basically a pie that then had to be divided between the Army and the Navy in terms of what was going to happen. The Navy was looking at a naval expansion program. They wanted to build a major fleet. They wanted to upgrade the fleet. Of course, the Army is looking at new weapons like the tank. You know, what's its impact? They want to develop that. They want to develop more trucks, the internal combustion engine, see what this is all about. And of course, you get the air people who very much want their slice of the pie to develop the Air Army into what will become the Army Air Corps. In 1920, as these controversies are going on, the Navy, using Marine Corps flyers and naval flyers, will conduct some bombing tests on an old battleship anchored in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay in 1920. And at the end, Wisconsin-raised future Admiral William Leahy will conclude, and in the report, he'll write the official report, and will say, and this is a direct quote, "It is impossible for airplanes to bomb ships and sink them from the air." Well, okay, maybe that's true of that test. But when word gets out of how that test was done, you'll realize how invalid it was. First of all, the ship was just sitting there. More importantly, however, it wasn't bombed by real bombs. They were using concrete and sandbags to bomb the ship. Is that a true test of what airplanes can do and ordnance can do to ships, particularly battleships, which were the kind of fulcrum, the keystone of the battle fleet, the Navy at the time? The answer to that, of course, is no. And so when word gets out about this, and that the Navy, by dropping concrete and sandbags, had determined that the airplane was ineffectual against battleships, a lot of people say, wait a minute, that's not a real test. You people cook the books. This is not good. We need a real test. And so Congress gets involved, and in the early part of 1921, directs, using their leverage, their budget leverage, directs new tests involving live ordnance against real targets. These tests are planned for the summer of 1921 with some follow-ups after that. Now, one of the things you'll need to understand, the Navy will view these as ordnance tests, but the air people, particularly the Army air people led by Mitchell, but others as well, and we'll talk about some of the others involved shortly, want to sink the ships. They want to demonstrate once and for all what really the airplane can do. So there's going to be a little bit of a debate here and a little bit of a kind of back and forth on what the objectives truly are. But that's the background of the tests. That's how we get to the summer of 1921 and the bombing tests themselves. Here's the plan of the tests. We're going to anchor some captured German ships 50 miles east of Cape Henry at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. There's going to be a series of tests over a series of days that are going to involve strafing and bombing. Again, it's an ordnance test. The idea is to get a sense using modern ships of what bombs can do, what strafing can do, what the possibilities are. We're going to start with some lighter ships, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the targets here in a second. After each wave goes through, observers will board the ship, investigate the damage, report the damage, and then come back off, and then the next wave will go in. So it's designed to be a methodical, sort of a science experiment in some ways, for lack of a better term. The entire Atlantic fleet is going to be there to observe and sink hulks if the planes cannot. And there are a lot of VIPs that are present. Secretary of the Navy is present. The Secretary of War is present. John Pershing, the Chief of Staff of the Army, is present. A lot of congressional people are there as well who have an interest in these matters. Are there as well. So this is a very public event, and the Air Corps promotes it very much. So this is a public event that is going to be happening here, both media coverage, but also under the eyes of VIPs. So there's the plan. What about the targets? I mentioned already we're going to use some targets. Let's talk about these targets. The four major types of ships involved in the fleet, combat ships involved in the fleet at the end of World War I, are represented here. You've got a submarine, U-117. You've got a German destroyer, capture G-102, the armored cruiser Frankfurt, and then the battleship Ostfriesland. All four of these ships are combat veterans. They'd all served in World War I, some of them with considerable distinction. They'd all been surrendered by Germany at the end of World War I. Now, I want to put to bed a common misconception about these ships. There are a lot of people, oh, they're old ships. They're fragile ships. They're not well maintained. They're old. They're obsolete. Nothing could be further from the truth. These ships are all 10 years old or less. These are modern ships. They stack up extremely well against the fleet, the ships in the inventory of the United States Navy. And there's one other thing about this that needs to be, these targets that needs to be mentioned. And it makes them, it enhances them as worthy measures of what the airplane can do. And it's that last bullet you see there, the German design philosophy. The Germans believe that the primary role of a ship, particularly the big battleships, was to stay afloat. And so they have revolutionized naval architecture in terms of flood control, in terms of compartmentalizing. So if you flood one compartment, it's not a particularly big, it can be localized, inherent in the design, to say nothing of any damage control that the crews can do. If you study, for example, the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and you realize some of the damage that some of these German ships took and still made it home, you realize the value of that. And so the German design philosophy, stay afloat, inherently part of the ship, even though there's no crew on board these ships as targets, obviously, they're still going to be very difficult to sink. In fact, there are a lot of people who say Ostfriesland alone is unsinkable. So these are worthy, these are not old ships. These are worthy targets for the airplanes. And that's something that needs to be borne in mind, and it is a misnomer that I want to correct right now. Here's who's going to be involved in these tests. Billy Mitchell takes the bulk of the Army Air Service, as it's known at the time, and forms the 1st Provisional Air Brigade with 125 planes, 100,000 personnel under his command. There are also some Marine and Navy flyers that will be involved in coordination, not under Mitchell's command, but in coordination with his operations. They'll use different types of bombs to get a different sense of what each can do, starting small, 125, 150-pound bombs, going all the way up, you can see, to some of the big ones, 2,000-pound bombs as well. The Provisional Air Brigade will be based at Langley Field, which today is a Langley Air Force Base. If any of you have been down to Hampton, Virginia, it's still very much an active Air Force base. They will train in the Chesapeake Bay. Mitchell will form the Provisional Air Brigade and deploy it to Langley in May of 1921. It will spend the next 4 to 6 weeks training. They'll be bombing painted silhouettes of ships. They'll be bombing old sunken hulks in the Chesapeake Bay, things like that. And one of the things, they develop 2 tactics. They realize 2 tactics as they go through this. Everybody realizes the importance of the test. They want to get this right. So they're practicing as much as they can. And the 2 things that they realize is, number one, a bomber in level flight has a very difficult time hitting a ship. Just by the vagaries of the wind, the different direction, speed, it's a very narrow target to hit in level flight. And by the way, I should point out, they're not using torpedoes. The Navy does not want to test torpedoes, have eliminated those. These are simply bombing attacks, strafing and bombing attacks that are going to be on the table for these tests. So if you can't, bombing at level flight is not really a good tactic. One of the things they come up with is they start to develop the first dive bombing tactics, where you dive in at 60 degrees, you dive in, and then you pull out and basically throw the bomb onto or right near the ship. Now, why do I say near the ship? Because that's the other tactic that Mitchell realizes, is he realizes that these ships are designed with very strong decks and very strong above the water armor, to repel shell fire and to protect against shell fire from Allied ships, US ships, British ships, things like that. But he realizes something, and I have brought along a handy dandy visual aid. If you dive bomb the top of the ship, like I would this can, you press down on it, you're hitting it at its strongest point. You're not going to be as effective. But if you near miss, because the armor ends at the waterline, if you near miss and you create what he calls a water hammer, where the explosion by the ship pushes water into the hull below the armor, you can crush it like I just crushed the can. And you can do as much or more damage. And so Mitchell will train his pilots in doing the water hammer. They're going to try and strike the ship too. They're going to try and knock through its armor, definitely. But the water hammer, Mitchell's counting on, particularly for the Ostfriesland, to take it down. And as I mentioned, everybody understands the importance of the tests on both sides, air and surface. This is one of the planes they use, loading bombs. This is loading 1,000-pound bombs on the twin-engine Martin MB2 before the tests. And you can see it's still a rudimentary plane when you consider this in 1921 versus what the Air Corps, the Army Air Forces at the time is flying in 1941. You can still see it's still a very infancy in many ways, still very much the World War I type of aircraft. And then the other type of plane they'll use for the smaller bombs, particularly for the strafing runs, and Mitchell will use one himself. He'll go out with every single raid. He'll observe every single raid and direct the formations in the air, is the Martin DH-4. And you can see they're flying right there over the Langley Aerodrome. So you can get a sense of what Langley Air Force Base looked like, or Langley Field at the time in 1921. Now, as I mentioned, we've talked a lot about people, we've talked a lot about plans, or we've talked a lot about things. Now it's time to talk about some of the people that are involved. And of course, the leader for the air units, and in many ways the leading acolyte, and certainly one of, if not the most experienced air leader in 1921, is Milwaukee's own Billy Mitchell, William L. Mitchell. Of course, it's what the airport's named after. The International Airport's named after him now. His father was a Civil War veteran, Wisconsin Senator Billy Mitchell. In World War I, achieved great fame leading the air service, and led one of the largest air offensives in history up to that time during the Saint Mihiel and the Argonne campaign, including commanding up to 1,000 aircraft in battle at one time. He is a leading light, and we've already talked a little bit about him in terms of the post-war debates and his advocacy for air power, advocacy for the airplane and its potential. One of the things about Billy Mitchell, and he's the assistant chief of the Air Service, and he'll never be the chief, even though he wants to be. And one of the big reasons for that is because his mouth can get him into trouble, as it will later, a few years after this, and ultimately get him court-martialed. He's very passionate, and sometimes he lets his passion say things that are not temperate or not that can make enemies where there should be friends. He's not afraid to ruffle feathers for what he considers to be a crusade on behalf of air power. But nonetheless, there's no other air leader in the Army with the kind of experience and rank to do this and to represent the Army than Billy Mitchell. And he's the perfect choice to lead the air attacks. Several other people are in the Air Brigade that you may have heard of. This one here, one of the pilots, is Hap Arnold, Henry Arnold. If Mitchell is the godfather of the Air Force, he's still a very much a leading light of the U.S. Air Force today. But the person that actually fathered the independent U.S. Air Force is this man here, Hap Arnold. And of course, led the Air Force, Army Air Forces during World War II, and then positioned them for independence immediately after the war. So that's Hap Arnold, one of the pilots. Clayton Bissell, you may or may not have heard of. He was one of the flight leaders heavily involved in the bombing runs on the test, and will lead several of those flights. Later command 10th Air Force in the China-Burma-India Theater, 1942 to 43, and then be Chief of Army Intelligence the latter half of World War II. So that's Clayton Bissell. St. Clair Street is a really interesting guy. He was Mitchell's rear seat observer through all of these tests. He'll later command 13th Air Force in 1944 to 45. And then after the war, Strategic Air Command, which becomes the Bomber Force, what becomes the B-52 force you may be familiar with from Vietnam. He's a key player in forming Strategic Air Command. And both he and also Arnold talk about how they form these commands, they run the Air Force, they set up their doctrine and how to train their pilots based on what they learned from Billy Mitchell. And Street admits, based on what I learned in part from the tests. So through St. Clair Street, you can draw a straight line from Billy Mitchell right through Strategic Air Command to its successor organizations that are on duty to this minute. And so I want to point him out as well. As I mentioned, there are Marine and Navy guys that are involved here. This guy here is one of my favorite Marine generals, Roy Geiger. He's the senior Marine aviator in the tests. He is a pioneer for Marine aviation, outstanding leader, outstanding flyer. Will later command the Cactus Air Force during the Battle for Guadalcanal, 3rd Amphibious Corps at places like the Marianas, Peleliu, Okinawa, and be the only Marine to command a numbered field army in 1945 when Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. is killed on Okinawa. Fascinating character and heavily involved in the tests on the Marine and Navy side. His deputy is this guy, Francis Mulcahy, who is, as I mentioned, second-ranking USMC aviator, later commands a Marine aircraft wing, and then the 10th Army Tactical Air Force also on Okinawa. Extremely good air leader, expert on close air support. Very, very good as well. And then this guy, Felix Stump, if you look at his career, very interesting. Commands an aircraft carrier in 1942 to 44, later commands a carrier task force in 44 to 45. He is the overall commander off Leyte Gulf on the morning of the 25th of October. If you've ever read the book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, the overall commander of that sector is Felix Stump. And later gets the Navy Cross for it, commands Second Fleet at Norfolk, and then ultimately SINCPAC out in Honolulu. So noted Navy flyer that's involved in this as well. Again, some names you may recognize just to give you some idea. Let's get into the tests themselves. Round one is the U-117 on June 22nd. And there she is anchored just before they show up. Several Navy and Marine biplanes will fly over her with 125-pound bombs. They fly over in level flight, drop a few spotting bombs to gauge the wind. They turn around, they come back, they drop their bombs in and around the submarine, and within 15 minutes, she's gone. Shocked everybody. Nobody expected that submarine to go that fast. We look back through World War II, when you think about Allied air power against the U-boats, the Japanese air power against the American submarines, and how they sunk several submarines, and you realize how vulnerable a surface submarine is to air attacks. But in 1921, that's a lesson that hasn't been learned yet. That's brand new. And so it sets off a shocking for some people, but a very victorious for other people start to the tests. A few weeks later, G-102 is attacked, and Mitchell is given a very free hand on this. And he sets up a series of strafing runs initially on the ship, and then sends in his bombers diving in on G-102. And within an hour, they have terminated her with extreme violence. They actually put a bomb down her stack. That's actually her on fire as she's going under, and very quickly demonstrate that a destroyer caught by air power won't live very long either. Now, it's worth pointing out, G-102, U-117, not armored ships, not armored, if at all. The next two targets, Cruiser Frankfurt and Battleship Ostfriesland, are armored ships. And a lot of people realize these are the warm-up acts, but the main event is still to come. 5 days later comes Frankfurt. Now, this is going to be a multi-wave attack. The first wave in the morning of July 18th, and if you look real closely at the photograph, you'll see it's been after that, will be the Navy and Marine flyers to go in, strafe the deck, mess up the ship, see what they can do with their bombs, see what they can do to the superstructure. And you'll notice if you look at closely, they've pretty effectively done that. And the Navy assessors actually had gone on board and said they'd so badly damaged the bridge that the captain probably was dead. And they might have, if this was wartime, they might have done what was called a mission kill. You don't necessarily sink the ship, but the ship is effectively out of action. That's the kind of damage that the Navy and Marine flyers did. And then that afternoon, this is one of the first strikes that Mitchell's flyers come in with. They will attack Frankfurt and score several hits in and around the cruiser. And within an hour, Frankfurt is also at the bottom of the Atlantic. So we've had three targets, all three sunk by air power. But everybody realizes at the end of the day, if Ostfriesland is not sunk by air power, all of those first three successes will be diminished. And here she is. Here's Ostfriesland just before her date with destiny on the 20th and 21st of July, 1921. You can see she's anchored, got targets, aiming points on both the bow and the stern turret, some other aiming points as well to measure angle of attack on the masts. You can see she's ready for what Mitchell can do. And Mitchell and his people understand this. He says this in 1925. He says, "This was our real test. If we could not sink this great ship, the efforts against the other smaller vessels would be minimized, and the development of air power against shipping might be arrested, at least for the time being." As far as he's concerned, all the chips are in the center of the table. The future of air power as a weapon of war may very well rest on what happens when he goes after Ostfriesland. He and his flyers go after Ostfriesland. So what happens? Round one on July 20th. First that morning, the Navy and Marine flyers will strike Ostfriesland, again, do very much like they were trying to do with Frankfurt, on the decks to try and damage the superstructure, try and get a mission kill, try and get some sort of do some sort of damage to knock her out, degrade her combat ability through bombing and strafing. And this is one of the early strikes here. And then in the afternoon, Mitchell, let me leave it here for a minute. And then in the afternoon, Mitchell will go after her with 6 bombs of smaller caliber, about 1,000 pounds or less. And we'll go after her against the water hammer. We'll hit her on the deck once as well. And at the end, as the late afternoon passes, and the inspectors board her, this is Ostfriesland's condition. Now I want you to look real closely at the ship. You'll notice the aft turret. This is the back side of the ship. The one that has the target on her, you'll notice how the guns are cockeyed. You'll notice the top part has been cracked open. The deck in and around that turret has been badly messed up, has been penetrated in places. And I want you also to look at the water line here. You'll notice the line. You'll also notice the dark part here of the water line. And you'll notice that should be underwater. Ostfriesland is starting to list to the left, to the port. She's starting to list. And there is water coming into her engine room and into various parts of her innards. The water hammer has broken seals, has broken cracks, and there is some flooding that is happening. The assessors, when they go on board, they assess that had this been wartime, she's out of action. She probably would make it home with good damage control, but Ostfriesland has to leave whatever battlefront this is, assuming that this was wartime. Now, from the observers on the transport Henderson looking at this through binoculars from a distance, this is not apparent. And so many of them, Mitchell's failed. He hasn't done the job. Well, there's no need to see anymore. We're going to go back to Norfolk. There's no need to worry. The experiment is over. Mitchell has failed. But close up, it's clear this battleship is wounded, and there might be a chance to get her the next day. The next morning, 8:30 in the morning, Clayton Bissell leads out 6 bombers to strike Ostfriesland. And here's the first strike of the day. They'll hit her twice, and then you'll also notice the strikes on both sides of Ostfriesland. That's the water hammer working. It's actually a pretty dramatic photo, if I do say so myself. It's about 8:50 in the morning. And after a specified number of hits, the 2 hits directly on the ship, plus the ones around her, the Navy says, halt all bombing, we're going to go aboard. And so this ship, which is USS Shawmut, which is governing the tests, steams over and puts a boarding party aboard. And this is late in the morning of July 21st. I want you to look at Ostfriesland here from above, and you'll notice here's the forward section. Here's the bow. It's sticking pronouncedly above the water. It's still relatively on an even keel. But notice how the back end is scorched. It's damaged. But you'll also notice, if you look real carefully, you can see she is most definitely sinking by the stern. She's down by the stern, and she's also listing to port. They say, when they assess her, this battleship is out of action. She's no longer combat effective, but at this point of damage, even with good damage control, she probably won't make port. So Mitchell has effectively mortally wounded Ostfriesland. But he wants to administer the coup de grace. And so that will happen at lunchtime. 10 MB2s with 2,000-pound bombs each will come in one after another, guiding in on the first bomb. They'll drop a spotting bomb to get the wind, and then the first one will come in on a diving attack, second one 30 seconds later, the third one 30 seconds after that, and so on. 4, 5, 6. This is from one of that strike, and you can see the water hammer once again doing its work. After the sixth plane, Mitchell calls it off. He says, when a death blow, and this is direct quote, when a death blow has been struck to a ship, there is no mistaking it. And the last bombs are not necessary. Ostfriesland, shuddering under the weight of the bombs, listing to port, down by the stern, begins to sink. And she begins to roll over, and that's what you see here in the picture. She turns turtle. Stern goes down, the bow comes up, claws at the sky, and then Ostfriesland disappears. St. Clair Street, watching this from behind Billy Mitchell on that plane overhead, stands up, unbuckles his safety harness, and starts waving his arms, yelling, "She's gone! She's gone!" Billy Mitchell has done it. He has proven that aircraft can sink a battleship solely from the air. Mitchell admitted at that moment, though, to this emotion. "We wanted to destroy her from the air," he wrote. "But when it was actually accomplished, it was a very serious and awesome sight." He knew what he had just done. He admitted later to having a little bit of a tear in his eye, watching that great ship go under at the hands of his aircraft. He knows what he has just done, and he knows the impact. He feels it in his bones. He then buzzes the Henderson. And if you look real carefully, you can see here's Billy Mitchell buzzing the Henderson in a victory loop here in the center of the picture. And if you look, you'll notice some of the naval observers and some of the congressional observers, some people are waving at him. Others, particularly several of the surface fleet admirals, are seen openly weeping, having watched Ostfriesland die. And that's where the title of this talk comes from. So it's a very mixed emotions on that deck. If you look very carefully, and this you can get this image online at the Naval History and Heritage Command, and you blow it up really, really close. You can see all manner of reactions, from pure joy to pure grief and everything in between. But there's Billy Mitchell buzzing the VIPs aboard the transport Henderson. And let me tell you, when he lands back at Langley, the party that they threw that night was, it makes Mifflin Street days look tame. They threw one heck of a party to celebrate what they had just done over these tests. They'll conduct some later tests 100 years ago last month, and then again in 1923 on some other old battleships. This is against USS Alabama, dropping phosphorus. They'll drop gas on there. They'll try and drop incendiaries and do more ordnance tests using Mitchell's flyers. And then in 1923, USS Virginia and USS New Jersey off of North Carolina. In every single case, Mitchell replicates his feat with Ostfriesland. Once the ordnance tests are done on the superstructure, his flyers come in and sink the ships and send them all to the bottom. Now, what's the impact of all of this? As we begin to wrap up, what's the impact of all of this? First of all, the aviators feel very validated. Their doctrine is sound as far as they're concerned. They feel very good about the airplane as an offensive weapon of war, which this momentum then turns into creation of the Army Air Corps in 1925, the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1941, and then, of course, the independent United States Air Force in 1947. This also spurs development of aircraft carriers in naval aviation, partly due to the fact that the Navy did not want the Army in control of aircraft carriers and aviation flown off from anything other than land-based. But there's no question, as they start thinking about the fleet design and the design of the U.S. fleet in the late 20s and 30s, the aircraft carrier is going to be a part of the fleet, and airplanes are going to be a part of the fleet. William Fulham, who was an observer as well, the fleet with superior air force, as he said, will no doubt win the next naval battle. And when you consider some of the naval battles, particularly in the Pacific, where the aircraft carrier was the decisive element, particularly Midway, Coral Sea, Philippine Sea, he's definitely prophetic. He's absolutely right about that. Now, many admirals do push back on the results' validity. And I will tell you that whenever I do this talk and I advertise it, I get some of that as well. It's a stunt. It didn't really prove anything. The ships weren't maneuvering. They weren't defending themselves. Fair points. But the fact remains, the ships were all sunk solely from the air. People said, well, the ships weren't maneuvering. They weren't defending themselves. They would shoot airplanes out of the sky. Airplanes would never get close enough to dive bomb. Well, that's probably true based on those slow 1921 airplanes. 100 miles an hour is considered a good speed for those Billy Mitchell's airplanes in 1921. By 1941, you're talking 275 to 300 mile an hour aircraft. And the development of aircraft from 1921 to 1941, when the United States enters World War II, airplanes have grown, have changed, have become more capable. The objections of 1921 may not necessarily be true for 1941 technology. And the tests ultimately foreshadow what happens in World War II, because Mitchell's feat will be replicated in wartime conditions. And in the time I have left, I'm going to run through those case studies for you right now. First is the Italian attack, the attack on the Italian fleet by the British Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, in Taranto, the 11th of November, 1940. They knock out half of the Italian surface fleet in the anchorage, actively defending themselves. And this is swordfish biplanes that do this, flying 90 miles an hour and dropping torpedoes. And they do a significant damage to the Italian surface fleet. So British have replicated. Of course, the Japanese study this. It helps them when they replicate this feat as well. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. You can see here, this is from a Japanese plane about 10 minutes, if not even 10 minutes into the attack. Here's Battleship Row in the front. Nevada, Arizona. West Virginia has just taken a torpedo hit. Oklahoma, of which many of you, if you've been following the news, have probably noticed a lot of the unidentified have now been identified and are coming home finally. Oklahoma is beginning to roll over already. And here's Battleship Row, and you can see what the Japanese are doing already. Now, granted, it's a surprise attack. Granted, they're in Anchorage, but nonetheless, the battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet are significantly damaged and significantly reduced because of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. 3 days after that, Japanese flyers in 2.5 hours sink the most modern battleship in the Royal Navy, HMS Prince of Wales, and one of the best battle cruisers in the Royal Navy, HMS Repulse, solely from the air. This is the first time that major capital ships like this have been sunk solely from the air while defending themselves, while maneuvering, and while conducting damage control. This may be a whole other talk for a whole other time, and the lessons from this, particularly when you talk about cyber warfare, and that I did a whole paper. That's a whole other talk for a whole other time. But this shocks the world. Winston Churchill said this was the greatest shock for him for the entire war, the British Prime Minister. And it did. It was a tremendous blow physically, but also to the prestige of the Royal Navy. And then anyone who doubted the airplane's power over the battleship and ability to sink the battleship from the air, if they had any doubts about that, they were dispelled by the next three cases I'm going to talk about in 1944 and 45. First, American air power against the Japanese battleship Musashi during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on the 24th of October, 1944. Now, it took a lot of bombs and torpedo hits to sink her. She's one of the two most powerful battleships ever built. It took a lot of bombs, it took a lot of naval ordnance from naval aviation to sink her, but they sunk her solely from the air during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And that's her under attack by American carrier aircraft. A couple weeks after that, in the Norwegian fjord, in Trondheim Fjord, the British Royal Air Force, using 12,000-pound bombs, tall boy bombs, went after the German battleship Tirpitz, the most powerful German battleship ever built. A sister to the equally powerful Bismarck that had been sunk in 1941. And you'll notice the water hammer plus some direct hits on the deck, and Tirpitz rolled over and sank right into the harbor. She was done for. And here's an explosion. Here's a tall boy that missed and is hitting the land. So you can get an idea of the power of the bomb. But again, RAF level bombers, Lancaster bombers doing the job. And then last but not least, the ultimate kamikaze, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful battleship ever built, Yamato, 7th April 1945. Again, solely sunk by American carrier air power on a one-way trip to Okinawa to try and influence the battle down there. And that's her magazines exploding as she's rolling over and sinking in the early afternoon of April 1945. What Billy Mitchell foreshadowed in 1921, that the airplane could dominate the skies and could damage, if not destroy, major capital ships like battleships, has in fact come to pass 20 to 25 years after the sinking of Ostfriesland. And when you consider what went into the test, much went into the tests, much flowed from the tests. And when you consider what Ostfriesland's sinking foreshadowed, I actually argue she's one of the most important shipwrecks of the last 105 years. When you consider, again, what she foreshadowed and what ultimately was inspired and came to pass afterwards and influenced by her sinking. Let me give you the last word. Douglas Waller, in his great book about Mitchell, A Question of Loyalty, he said the sinking of Ostfriesland marked the beginning of what would be a slow end for battleships, which we've explored in the last few slides, that slow end. U.S. Air Force Official History of World War II in 1948 said this. I think it's a very good summary. Disputes arose as to the manner in which the experiment directed by the Navy had been conducted, and the Joint Board's report tended to deprecate the effectiveness of aerial bombing. But the fact of the sinkings was indisputable. You can, no matter what the debates were immediately after the bombing tests of 1921, the summer of 1921, the fact remains that Billy Mitchell and his pilots proved airplanes unaided can sink any ship that's put in front of them, any warship that is. And that from that, much has followed, as we have discussed. And that makes what Billy Mitchell did a tremendous contribution, not just to aviation, but certainly to Wisconsin aviation, but also to the development of warfare and the development of the airplane as an instrument of warfare 100 years ago this past summer. If you'd like some more information, I encourage you to look at these sites. We already talked about A Question of Loyalty a little bit. Billy Mitchell's Wing Defense, which includes his accounts of the tests. That's available actually online as a PDF. It's in the public domain now. Pictures and accounts are available at you can see there, history.navy.mil. That's some outstanding resources. I recommend them to you. And then if you want to see Ostfriesland sink for yourself, the test footage, which is preserved in the National Archives, has been digitized, has been put on YouTube. And so you just search for the bombing tests and you'll see several different snippets of footage from the tests. And so with that, I appreciate everybody's attention tonight. And if anybody has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them. And thank you all very much for your attention.
I think everybody can unmute themselves if they want to ask questions. Chris, let me start the question. This happened in 1921. In 1922, there was the treaty to limit naval development, and from that, 2 of the U.S. battle cruisers were converted into the aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga. is there a direct connection between the tests and the laying down of the two aircraft carriers?
The short answer to that is yes. One of the things that in that, it's the Washington Naval Treaty is what he's talking about, and it limited battleship construction. It basically tried to forestall a naval arms race among the United States, Britain, Italy, France, and Japan. One of the things that every single signatory nation wanted to keep out was aircraft carriers. They didn't address aircraft carriers or naval aviation in there. And part of it was everybody wanted, based on what had happened in the summer of 21 with Mitchell, they wanted room to experiment and see what this new potential weapon of war could be. Lexington and Saratoga, absolutely. The Japanese did the same thing with two of their battle cruisers that became the carriers Akagi and Kaga, which were two of the major carriers for the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, and then were sunk at the Battle of Midway in 1942. So yes, you can draw a straight line from 1921 to Lexington and Saratoga.
I see a question that's also been posed in the chat function. Has naval bombing changed to direct hits to the deck now that bombs are more powerful, or is underwater torpedo use still best because warships are unarmored below the waterline?
This is a great question, and this is something that actually naval architecture changed also, and I didn't really get into this because of time constraints. Naval architecture changed as well because of the airplane and because of what Mitchell had shown with the water hammer. And the best example I can give you is look at USS Arizona as built in 1916, and then look at what happens to her when she's refit in the 1930s. One of the things that naval architects will start to do, both refitting older ships, but also for new construction, for example, aircraft carriers that were used in World War II, things like that, is they'll start to armor the hull. And they'll create most battleships, particularly Prince of Wales, which we looked at earlier, was built with what's called an armored citadel. The idea is that the very bow and the very stern are kind of hollow soda cans, like I demonstrated earlier. But the central part of the ship, where the armaments are, where the engines are, where the guts and brains that you need to accomplish your mission, that's actually armored now. The other thing that ships will start to develop is they will start to develop torpedo blisters, those big bulbous. If you do ship modeling or you look at the profiles of some of these ships, you'll notice under the water, many of them seem to bow out. And part of that is to be anti-torpedo, but also to try and deflect any sort of near miss, any sort of water hammer effect. Because then the idea is the bowed out hull, there's an open space between that and the actual inner hull. So that space is designed to absorb the shock of a torpedo hit or a water hammer or anything like that. Those developments of the 1930s have carried forward into modern shipbuilding also. So today, it depends on honestly, it would depend on the type of ship. But today, some of the anti-ship missiles can replicate what Mitchell did in 1921, and certainly what was done in World War II.
Yeah, I have a question. How much did the Japanese kind of study some of the impacts of this testing and then use it to their own designs as they entered into World War II?
That's an outstanding question, and I'm actually going to recommend a book called Shattered Sword, and it looks at Midway from a Japanese perspective. And one of the things it talks about is Japanese design philosophy. The Japanese studied these lessons, and they realized that having a powerful naval air force would be something that they needed to have. And they proved that value, obviously at Pearl, and then with Force Z, and then of course the Japanese Naval Air Force continued to be a threat all during World War II. But one of the things that the Japanese, they emphasized in their shipbuilding was they emphasized offensive factors. They wanted to take the fight to the enemy. And so a lot of the inherent defense that is built into American ships in the 30s, and even something as simple as a CO2 system. The Americans developed a very significant and a very complicated CO2 system. In case there was a fire on board ship, you push the button and it could isolate and then remove the oxygen and basically strangle a fire. Excuse me, the Japanese had that. It was not as complex. And if you took damage in the right place, you might have half the ship's CO2 system get knocked out with one hit. The Americans had much more fail-safe. I'm simplifying a very complicated discussion, but the Japanese most definitely realized, thanks to Billy Mitchell, that one of the ways that they could maximize the power of their fleet was using a naval air force. And that they put a lot into the development of that in the late 20s and the 30s with effects that we have seen.
Chris, one of the other chat questions here is, did the Germans invent watertight compartments that made them unsinkable?
The answer to that is no. And I would argue that there's never been a ship that's unsinkable. Every time you hear somebody say a ship's unsinkable, like, oh, I don't know, RMS Titanic, it usually finds a way to be at the bottom of the ocean. Actually, some of the first watertight compartments on an iron ship were with the ironclads of the Civil War. And there was an idea that they had to localize flooding, and they had to localize flooding a lot faster than sailing ships, because wooden sailing ships and wooden steamships, inherently in the hull, there's a certain amount of flotation because it's wood. Iron, that's not necessarily the case, or steel. So you have to compartmentalize better and localize the flooding faster, because otherwise you're going to lose too much buoyancy. The Germans took it to a whole other level before World War I. And the book that I would recommend on that is Castles of Steel by Robert K. Massey, which is an outstanding history of the naval war in World War I. He gets into this and the design and the rivalry between the British and the Germans, and the different design philosophies that they have. But it's the Germans took it to a whole other level. And in many ways, our Navy learned from studying those German ships before Mitchell sank them.
Other questions for Chris? Chris, thank you for an outstanding presentation. Hope to see you at the museum soon.
Come on by and see me. Thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.